Okay, good morning, class. And today, what we are basically going to do is we're going to actually talk about directors. Okay, so yes, so what do we actually do is we will start the class, but we will first have something where we are actually going to talk about. We start with our work with saying who is a director. Before we actually go into more details of how directors are elected, the process, the rules and regular responsibilities, but who is a director of a company, right? So it's someone, any person who's elected or appointed to manage a company's business affairs, right? Company's business and company's business affairs, right? So, and every registered company must have at least one director, right? So, who the directors are, that needs to be recorded in the company's register, right? So, as I said, it's a director is someone who's appointed to take responsibility of for the policy of formation of the company and control of a company. Okay, and directors advise. They are the ones who advise the management how to work, and they also give directions to the management how to work, how they should look after the welfare of the shareholders, who are the actual owners of the company. Okay. So this is what I said about a director. See, there are a company with all the board of directors up there. So board of directors is appointed, right? They're appointed to act on behalf of the shareholders to run the day-to-day affairs, right? So they are working on behalf of the shareholders. So this is where we are talking of the agency theory coming into play. What are the roles of the board of directors? To establish the vision of the company, and based on that, the mission and the values, because vision, mission, they act as a guideline for the operation of the company. The values that needs to be promoted throughout the company, they need to review the goals of the company and also to determine the company's policies. The second comes up to set the strategy and structure, right? Looking into the present and future opportunities, threats, risks, which is there, the external environment, and also looking into the strengths and weaknesses within the organization. So they have to align the external environment with the internal environment, and accordingly come up with design with the right kind of strategy, and also decide how to implement them, right? So for that, for implementing it, there has to be a proper structure to support that strategy, right? Delegate work to management with regard to authority. So there has to be decentralization of power, monitoring and evaluating the policies, strategies, and business plans that's been implemented. So also the board, it's the board who determines the monitoring criteria, monitoring of the management. What should be the criteria? They decide upon it. They ensure that the internal controls are effective, efficient, and they need to communicate with the senior management. So there has to be a good board management relationship, right? The fourth one comes up is where to exercise accountability to shareholders and also be responsible to relevant stakeholders. So they need to communicate to both the shareholders and other stakeholders. There has to be a good and an effective relationship. It has to be a very good relationship, and the stakeholders' interest has to be, shareholders and the other stakeholders' interest has to be taken into account. Sharing of proper information at the right time has to be there. Maintain a good relationship with them. Okay. Next comes up is the responsibilities of the board. First of all is to determine the company's strategic objectives and policies, then have to monitor the progress towards achieving these objectives and policies, not just design, but also ensuring that it's achieved, appointing the senior management, that includes the CEO, and also they are responsible for the company's activities towards different stakeholders, and shareholders being the most important. The managing director or the chief executive is responsible for the performance of the company, right? Uh, they're responsible as per the directions by the board's overall strategy. And so the chief executive officer has to report to the chairman or the board of directors. Okay, the directors also look after the affairs of the company, and that's why they are in a position where people should trust them. They are responsible for ensuring that the accounting books of account are kept in the right manner. It's everything is being recorded, right? Director is also required to pay the debts of his company. They're required to help. They have to help in the process of paying the debts of this company, even though like director is not responsible, right? So the company is a separate legal entity, the corporation, but then still the director has a responsibility to help the business to pay all its debts, right? The director should always exercise their powers for a proper purpose in a proper way, right? They should not be misuse the powers. Directors should also be faithful. They should be honest, right? In the way they are working, which is for the best interest of the company, right? Directors must act when they are acting. They are putting them when they are acting where their work is concerned. They're discharging their work. They should do it with proper care. They should do it with all the due skills required. They should be vigilant, and they should consider the interest of the employees. What about the duties? Duties is firstly to act within their powers in accordance with the company's constitution, company's law, and to use it only for the purposes for which the powers for which they are actually meant for. Then they should be promoting the success of the company. They should, for the benefit of all their members, they should when they make judgment, it should be an independent and impartial judgment. And when they are actually working, they should be whatever decisions they make, it should be done with the proper care, proper skills, and proper expertise. Their work. They should avoid any conflicts of interest that comes up. Not to expect, they should not accept any benefits from third parties, right? And they should declare an interest in a proposed transaction or arrangement. Like if they have any interest in a particular transaction arrangement taking place, they should declare that interest. So this is a typical board. That's how it looks like, the model. So who are the board of directors? Right, board of directors is a body of elected or appointed members who together oversees or looks after the activities of the organization, right? So other names: board of directors, board of governors, board of managers, board of regions, board of trustees, board of visitors, right? So when we talk of board, now board has there are some factors which are important for effective board involvement, right? So there are certain factors which guides in a typical board, like how to operate. One is the external context, which is the characteristics of the organization and its environment. And the internal context, board internal context, which is talking about the characteristics of the board. External is organization with the environment. Internal is the board characteristics of the board. Now, as a little more in details, when we talk of board intercontext, it's talking of not only the board demographic characteristics, that's age, gender, all, but also talking of the cognitive, relational, and functional characteristics. Okay, when we talk of outer context, this is where we are talking of on the context in which the boards work, right? So this includes the characteristics of the organization and its environment, that is size of the firm, the sector, industrial sector where they are operating, where they belong to, the ownership structure, the life cycle of the firm, right? Now, board is made up of individual men and women who are elected by the shareholders for multiple year terms. They can have multiple years, right? In most cases, directors either have a vested interest in the company, they have interest, or they are working in the upper management of the company, senior management, or they can be independent from the company, but they are known in the business world for their abilities. It can be different types. Number of members on the board, it can vary from it can be as large as where we have 16 directors for Walt Disney, and on the other hand, where we have Tiffany and Company, they have eight board members. So it varies. Okay, so and there should be an independent director who should be strong, and independent element, that is an independent director. There has to be there who would be able to give a neutral judgment, right? And would not be part of the executive team. Okay, what are the committees on the board? Audit committee. Audit committee, as we had already explained in when we were talking about corporation. So it's comprised of independent directors which meets on a regular basis, and they look after the internal control mechanism, disclosure control mechanisms, and procedures related to financial reporting. So the main functions are to ensure that the company's financial reporting system is adequate, right? To monitor and evaluate the adequacy of the internal accounting control methods, to review on the audit plan, to also look into the appointment, performance, and independence of the external auditor. Compensation committee, which looks after the base compensation, stock option awards, and incentive bonuses of companies' executives, right? That includes the CEO also, right? Okay, so in exchange for providing their services, the directors are paid a yearly salary plus compensation for meeting stocks and everything, right? So this is all when they sit, directors sitting on multiple boards, they get also fees. So everything is being looked after by the compensation committee. Okay. Next comes up is remuneration committee. So it should have a minimum of 3 directors, majority of whom are independent and chaired by an independent director. They decide the remuneration that has to be paid to the non-executive directors, and the audit committee ensures that the company accounts exhibit the true and fair position of the company's financial health, right? So this is where it comes. You also have the nomination committee, which should have a minimum of 3 directors, majority of whom again should be independent and chaired again by the independent director. The main function to assess or evaluate the board's performance and also the organization's needs in terms of the skills, knowledge, and experience for directors, the CEO and senior management, and they should make recommendation to the board regarding all the appointments, retirements, and terms of office. They should be able to assess and review the directors, induction of directors, analyze their performance and development, ensure that there is a proper succession plan is there for the board as well as the key executives. Coming up to the legal duties of the board, right? So legal duties means where we talk or where which talks of director having two duties, the legal duties, duty of care and duty of loyalty. Now, duty of loyalty is where it talks about where a director should be loyal to the company's shareholders. Okay, so when they are and when they are sitting on companies, 2 companies which have conflicting interest, they should resign from one of the board, because that otherwise what is it, it's the breach of loyalty. So if they resign, that means they are actually showing that they are loyal to the shareholders of both the companies. Okay, if they do not resign. So if say for instance, like if a good director is sitting on the board of Limeridian as well as on Taj Tashi, both are in the hospitality sector, hotel industry, hotel business. So it's a huge project coming up, and both these hotels are actually trying to get that project. So if the director is sitting on both the boards, means what, they get to know what the tender is, what tender is being given by both the company, both the hotels. So it'll be fair, and both the hotels would actually want to know what the other hotel is doing. So they would, what is the tender details. So it'll be really being disloyal to the shareholders if this person, the director, is sitting on both the boards, because that's not fair. Right? That's not fair to anyone. So it's usually he or she should resign from one of the boards or from both. Duty of care, when talks about that, about the director, that he should, he should actually look into all the aspects and make all the aspects, looks into all the information and make, while making decision, it has to be impartial. Okay, so while you should look into all the possible alternatives that's there, right? So when a director can actually demonstrate that he has acted with loyalty and exercised all possible care, the courts will not go against his decision. Courts will really believe it. As long as the board members are fulfilling the legal duties, the court or the legal system will not interfere with the working of the organization, even if there may be other problems. So what happens? Laws offer only a general definition of the directorial role. Okay, so the law must be sufficiently flexible to cope up with the changing business developments that is there. That's it's just these legal law, the laws only talks about what the duties of the roles of the director is, but then it should be so flexible enough to incorporate the changing that is happening in the business world. Otherwise it's difficult, because new problems are coming and there are new questions to solve. So it has to be flexible, the law has to be flexible. The board has 5 primary functions. First is to select, regulate and evaluate, and if required, to replace the CEO, right? To determine the management compensation, review the succession planning of the CEO, review and approve the financial objectives, the major strategies and plans of the corporation, provide advice and counsel to top management, right? Select and recommend to shareholders for election of candidates for the board of directors. Like those board or entire board does not finish their term at the same time. 1/3 of the board has to retire after 3 years. So the existing board members who are there still there, they would help to nominate the candidates for the as a new board members, and then request it's up to the shareholders to elect, right? They would recommend, select and recommend to shareholders the probable candidates. The board should also review the adequacy of all the systems that is there, right? Which whether they are systems of the organization, whether they are complying with the laws and regulations of the country. Okay, so board has to, if you have to, has to attend to quarterly results and management's projections for the next quarter, company's long-term strategic goals, capital structure, debt financing, everything comes up. Resource allocation, whether they should buy or sell assets, the dividend policy, R&D projects, status of the competitors, and the company's global prospects. Everything comes under the purview of the board. They also have to look after the CEO succession plan. So that's the biggest challenge for the board, to come up with a proper CEO succession planning. Okay, because what happens? The CEO has control over the all the information, access to senior staff, right? So has to, and board, if the board has to get information, like you have to know about how the senior staff is working, how the employees are working, they have to take the help of CEO. So the CEO of the company should be someone with whom they can work with, has to be someone who's really good, right? Okay, so what happens is like this is basically a book of called The Hero's Farewell, right? Which is talking about the various strategies the CEOs have for conducting, right? With regarding to CEO succession planning process, right? It talks of that monarchs who choose not to leave voluntary, but either die in office or are overthrown, generals who leave reluctantly and spend their retirement planning a comeback, ambassadors sometimes retain close ties with their former firms, governors who willingly serve a limited term and leave to pursue new interests. These are different types of CEOs, like how CEOs work. Okay, so and accordingly, these are the strategies that CEOs have. They do it. So these are quite interesting, and each results in a different effect. Each has a different effect. Okay, so why main thing for board of directors is they have to know that, you know, it's the CEO succession plan is their responsibility, not the CEOs. They have to do it, because in case a CEO is resigns or leaves, or has to retires, or there's a mishap happening, or the CEO is asked to leave, like thrown out, what will happen? Who's going to take over? So there has to be someone who has to be groomed, who would be able to take up the position of the CEO when the present CEO leaves leaves the position or vacants the position. Okay. Uh, what also happens is like they should always be familiar enough with the senior staff. Board should be familiar to get to a perspective on the CEO's performance, and also to find out who could be the possible candidate for the CEO's position. To do this, a board has to know who the senior members are, how they are working, so it have to be close to them, right? And the search has to start immediately. Search and find, and then go for the training. So next that comes up, like when we're talking of CEO, of automatically the management, board management relationship issues, there has to be a very good relationship, right? So directors are what they are actually responsible for the management, they're responsible to the management for nomination, compensation, and information. They're responsible to they are responsible, or they are I'll not say responsible, they are totally dependent on the management for the nomination, compensation, for information. So, and many directors there, they do not want to actually devote time for in the company, right? So what they have to look into, depend on the CEO, the management, to provide with them with all the information, necessary information, right? Instead of themselves actually going and searching for it, right? So now what happens is, like, when we talk about in terms of Peter Drucker, whenever an institution malfunctions, right, as consistently as board of directors have in nearly every major incidents that had happened the last 40 to 50 years, it is futile to blame the men. It's the institution that malfunctions. You cannot blame the board. It's the system, right? If you allow CEOs to receive a huge amount of compensation when the returns is very less in the company is not doing so well, then it's going to be a problem. And the example of here is where we talk of Enron, Adelphia, WorldCom, HealthSouth, and so these are some of the examples where CEOs are responsible. Directors can never know uh, much about the operation of the company as the management. Why? Because it's the CEO who's heading the management who actually implements the work, the directives given by the board, and they know what's exactly happening. So the CEO has more information, right? The correct, accurate information. So the board is dependent on the CEO for providing with accurate, timely information, right? And what happens? So CEOs sometimes, they play a dominant role. They play a dominant role also when the board members are totally dependent on them. So the CEOs take advantage of that by playing a dominant role in selecting and inviting board members. When board meetings happens, board members do not even get to know everyone when the meeting is happening. So CEO selects their own people whom the CEO is close to, and accordingly the board meeting happens so that the decision passed is in favor of the CEO. Okay. So there isn't much point in fussing over the definition of an independent director or the existence or makeup of board committees or the procedures for electing directors if the information they get is inadequate. So independent director or make up board committees or election procedures of directors, it doesn't help if the information of the board doesn't have the right information, then it's no use to have this. And not many boards allow themselves to be kept in dark for long. It doesn't happen. So they would actually start taking actions to actually getting to know what the problem is and start trying to solve it out. Okay. So, in the final analysis, the board it is the board ultimately who has the responsibility for the company and is ultimately the ultimate decision-making factor, right? So and management has the expertise to run the company, but the decision is made by the board, and the management runs the company on the directions by the board. So board has to exercise the power. If they don't, it's a problem. CEO, chairman. Who's the CEO? CEO is the chief executive officer who's head of the management. Who's the chairman? Chairman is the head of the board of directors, right? So why are we talking of CEO here when we are discussing directors? Because sometimes the board's chairman is also the CEO of the company, right? So CEO and chairman is the same. It can happen, right? So, but the CEO is accountable to the board of directors. Now, the question that comes up here is like CEO is representing the management, chairman is representing the board, right? The board is elected by the shareholders, and CEO is running the organization for discharging, or their primary responsibilities is to implement the decisions of the corporations, managing all the operations, right? So, and has to maintain a good relation between the board and the management. Now, the main difference is where it comes up is the CEO is the chairman is included in the hiring and firing of CEO or directors or presidents, but CEO is not responsible for hiring and firing of chairman, right? So that's the difference. So what happens up here is, like, if the CEO and chairman is the same person, then what will happen? Then who's going to take care of what? Before we actually go into it, like these are some of the questions that is there. Who is hired? The CEO, the chairman? Of course, the chairman, right? And what's the difference between the rights of the chairman and the CEO? So you have this is some blogs there. You can actually read it and get some answers, right? So CEO is a company's top decision maker, and all other executives are answerable in the management, right? Whereas the chairman of the board of the company is the head of the board of directors. The board is elected by the shareholders and so they are elected to protect the shareholders' rights. Okay, the directors can hire and fire the CEO, but CEO chairman has that full chairman. It's headed by the board chairman, but CEO cannot do that. Okay, so the question that comes up is why the chairman and CEO should be the same person, and why they should not be the same person. Now, if they are the same person, then there can be conflict of interest that comes up, and that is the problem. But on the other hand, if they are also different person, the work becomes much more easier, right? Delegation of power, and it becomes much more effective. But then again, if they're the same person, it's easy to make decisions and implement that immediately. That is also there, right? So can the chairman be the CEO? Yes, it can happen at times. Okay, so now when the data that was collected from the corporate library, 519 out of 1900 publicly traded companies had a separate CEO and chairman, right? So, and so you see, it's only five, most of them had same person taking the position of CEO and chairman, right? So here the question that comes up, and the chairman of the board is also the CEO, so it makes what happens, it's the management is accountable to a body which is again controlled by the management. We had said that the management is answerable to the board, yes, and who's heading the board? The CEO. Head of the management is also head of the board, so the management is reviewed by the head of the management is answerable to the board, which is headed by the head of the management. So that's what happens. So the CEO is actually evaluating his or her performance. So that doesn't work always, right? So, but then what happens? Like separating CEO and chairman would sometimes it was also felt that some would, like 20% believe that it would have a negative impact. 20% felt when the survey was done that the CEO and chairman, if they're separate, would have a positive impact, and 60% felt that it's neutral. The separating the roles will not have any impact. Okay, so those who felt that there would be a negative impact, why? Because they felt it's best to have a company led by one person. It's easy for the decisions to be implemented faster. Those who felt that separating the two positions would have a positive role. Why? Because it means that the CEO's performance can be evaluated, cannot take things for granted. There'll be more accountability there. Okay, so that's always there. And so the board of directors can, but board of directors can be effective uh, only when it's the chairman wants it to be. It is the chairman who, over the time, is the main person of the board, whether it's composition, agendas, priorities, positions. If the chairman is powerful, if the chairman is really effective and efficient, independent, strong person, then board becomes effective, and then so the management cannot do anything. Otherwise, what happens if the chairman is someone who's passive, who's not involved with the board meeting, so just a rubber stamp, then the management is going to take undue advantage. Okay, so as long as the CEO controls the quality, quantity, and timing of the information that is presented to the directors, they can never be assured of getting what they need for true independent oversights. If CEO has the full control, board will not have, there's no assurance that the board will get all the materials, everything correctly, right? So, which is why what is needed is to have an independent director. There is a need to have an independent outside director, like who would act as a lead director, who would review the agenda, who would look into the concerns of the organizations, and who would also look into the concerns of the other outside directors. And that's only it's possible to ensure that the CEO does not manipulate with the information. So next topic is ex-CEO as directors, right? Ex-CEO of the company, should they be made directors? That's the question that comes up. There are companies where you have ex-CEO on the board, right? what is the main objection to have an ex-CEO on the board? They can dominate the board agenda and decisions, right? They can do so, right? And sometimes some of the inside directors who got their jobs because of this retiring CEO, they would like to pay their tribute and gratitude, and they would not contradict what he or she would say, and would be loyal out of fear, right? This CEOs would, ex-CEOs would try to exercise enough power even after retirement, because it can happen. That can always happen, right? Sometimes they can also tend to influence the non-executive directors who were recruited by the CEO, outgoing CEO, right? Uh, but retired CEOs who care about their successor may not be effective directors. Retired CEO who want to dominate the board should not be at the board at all. But on the other hand, because the ex-CEOs have vast experience, right? They have more knowledge than the company, than anyone about the company than anyone else. So it's always they can be kept also. So but to actually the best solution that came up was, what should be done is, it said that it's best if the company keeps the CEO off the board, but keep them as a consultant. Okay. Next comes up is director nomination, right? Nomination. So we know directors are elected by the shareholders, right? But they have no role in the nomination process. So it's a nominating committee who decides on the candidate, who would be the probable candidates for the board position, for being a director, right? So they are the potential candidates, once they are nominated, then they are interviewed by a full board that includes the CEO, okay, and then they are being elected by the shareholder vote, right? Now what happens is, the job of the shareholders, right, it's to ensure that the board does their job properly, right? That also means to have the right people on the board, right? That is also there. So they should actually be have a people, they should elect people who should be able to represent their interest and should work on their behalf, right? But what happens is, like, when although we are talking of the election, and we just described how the directors are elected, it does not always happen in reality. It's because it's the management who selects the candidates, they run the election, and the management counts the votes. So shareholders do not nominate directors, right? Without they cannot nominate any directors on their own without spending money. So having the right does not guarantee its use. Right to elect doesn't mean that it can be used, right? They have to spend huge amount of money on their own candidates. The shareholders have to pay, but there's no guarantee that that candidate will be elected, because it's the management who runs the entire show. They run the election, they count the votes. Anything can happen, right? So the board's nomination committee plays a very active role now in than the past rubber stamping of the management's candidates. But but the critical appointment and any renewal on chairman, on CEO agreement, is usually at their initiative, a process which falls far too short of true independence. The process of selecting of the candidates, like, though it should be like done impartially, but it does not happen in reality, right? But on the other hand, the non-executive directors, they cannot fulfill their external accountability responsibility, right? If they disagree with the CEO, or even with the board majority, if the board majority is disloyal. So nomination committee is non-executive directors, they cannot perform if they are into conflict with the CEO, or the majority of the board is disloyal, then it's problem. Director election, right? So in theory, what happens? Directors are elected by their constituents, that's their shareholders. But what happens in the electoral process had not been an effective mechanism which ensures that the directors would represent the interest of the shareholders, because directors are mostly managers, CEOs, candidates, and the CEO manipulates the election process. So CEO picks up the candidates, and no one would dare to run contest against them. CEO counts the votes, and then they are elected. So CEO has the access to the funds, and so everything funds of the company, and the board members who are elected are obliged to the CEO and becomes a puppet actually. They do not do say anything against the management, right? Okay, so it's what happens is, in the sense that the election process is just a formality that is being done. It has to be done, so it's a formality. It looks like it's election is happening, but actually it's not so. So, and the shareholders cannot vote no to unopposed directors. They cannot vote. They can only uh, refrain from not voting. Okay, they can only do that. But then what happens if shareholders are not voting? One person votes, and one single vote, and the person is elected as the director. And that one vote can come from anyone. From it can be from a single shareholder also, right? Who has got some benefits from the management, or is in the close to the management. So actually, in the election process, what happens is the managers will actually ask some limited shareholders to actually go for the voting, who are close to the management, right? Staggered boards. What do you mean by staggered boards? What happened was, a director would serve a succession of yearly terms, either until retirement or until a decision was made by the nominating committee not to re-nominate him. So that's what is known as a staggered board, right? So staggered board. So what happened is, where if you go more into details, like companies nominated directors for 3 staggered sets of 3-year terms, right? Board is divided into 3 sets or classes of directors who would be nominated for re-election every 3 years. So nominating after 3 years, right? That's staggered. Staggering is breaking down. Previously, they would actually go on serving for as long as until they retire, as long as they are eligible to work and retire, or if the nominating committee would not nominate them. But later on, it said 3 years. So, and break it up. After 3 years, if they want to go for re-election, or if the nominating committee feels that they are eligible, then they would be nominated again. Okay. Okay. So when we talk of the staggered board structure, right, that was a positive move for ensuring the continuity of the board service, but it ignored to the fact that it is up to the shareholders to decide whether the directors should continue or not, right? The direct shareholders consent was never taken into consideration. Confidential voting, right? Confidential voting is by the shareholders. Shareholders are voting, like when we have elections, voting takes place. Nobody knows whom we are voting for. So that's confidential voting. That should be in place. Shareholders should be free to vote and not pressurized to vote for a particular candidate. Okay, so, but what happens, it becomes very the managers, corporate managers, they would get to know who has voted and how, and who has voted for whom, and who has not voted for their candidates, and that's where problem comes up. So what happens is, in that case, that the shareholders are sometimes being persuaded, forced to vote, change their votes to support the management. Okay, but there are many companies have actually adopted some sort of confidential voting policy, because it's what happens is, because the corporate community has decided that cost very little but means a lot to shareholder activists. It's very little, it doesn't cost much to have confidential voting, but for the shareholders it means a lot. Though there are some companies who doesn't want to go for confidential voting, because then the shareholders may not elect the directors who are close to the management. Director compensation, right? Director compensation, this is the general thing that comes over. It's what happens in US, but it differs from country to country. So they have compensation which is over 40,000 US dollars, but it depends on the economic condition of a country, and accordingly it varies. They can get some education and charitable gifts, life insurance, travel expenses for their spouse also to accompany them for board meetings, and some stock grants are also given to them. Okay. Many companies are also give directors huge discounts on the products that they are being launched. Some also give their directors today what's happening, they are beginning to pay their directors entirely in stocks, right, based on your performance. Okay. So directors often get business from the companies for their law, consulting, or investment banking firms as well. So the pay schemes hardly relate to the performance of the company or the performance of the director. The director will get the fees whatever happens to the organization, no matter what, right? But stock component, the stock, issuing stock to the director's compensation is it's rarely significant. It doesn't play much importance where the company's performance comes into play. Okay. Why? Because so what happens is, not only do most of the directors hold a significant portion of the total company stock, but their pay has not been designed to align with the interest of those of the shareholders. No, they, even if they are not fulfilling their duties towards the shareholders, still they get paid. So it doesn't affect much. There have been two major changes in the directors' compensation package. Once that directors, more directors today are paid in stock or stock options, which is closely aligned with that of the interest of the shareholders. And secondly comes up is directors' retirement plans, which had doubled, more than doubled from 1986 to 1991. Have today have disappeared. There's no director retirement plans. Okay, so what is seen today is stock related compensation for directors could encourage measures to act that would help to for a short term increase in the stock price, that at the sacrifice of the long term visibility of the company. Okay, so it's today the stock compensation for the directors, it's there, it's only been given from the short term perspective, not looking into the long term perspective. So that has been there, and this is a problem which which can be addressed, which this is a problem which it's not that it cannot be solved, it can be addressed. How? By issuing of restricted stocks. Okay. Now director compensation, when we talk of, it is one of the most sensitive and complex tasks which the board members and the company has to face, because no member on the board can view the issue without any conflicts. So it's a very sensitive issue. So okay. Now what happens also is the options for implementing safeguards for the director's compensation is full disclosure of the director compensation. Is this is one of the options that's there. The director's compensation needs to be revealed to the disclosed to the shareholders, and also it needs to be reviewed by an independent expert. Interlocking directorship. Interlocking directorship is this is a very popular type of directorship, where the director is the top executive of another company. The top executive of another company can be director of another company. So A CEO of a company becomes director of another company. So what's that one? There's a problem up here because you get to know information about other companies, and if it's rival companies, it can be really problem. There can be conflict of interest coming up. Okay, time and money is also there. So if the director is sitting on multiple boards on multiple companies, then what happens? Then the director cannot give much time, right? But there's a huge amount of money involved. Each time the director sits on the board meeting, they get huge amount of money. So that's again another problem. Next comes up is independent outside directors. Uh, independent directors, the concept of independent directors has become very, very important over the past more than 20 years now, because of all these scams that's coming up. Right? Who is an independent director? The independent director is a person who has no connection to the company other than the seat of the board, other than their position. So there has to be a strong and independent person, independent director on the board, right? Who would be able to actually exercise judgment on a neutral perspective, independently on the corporate affairs, and also they should be independent from the management, from the affairs of the management. They should not be part of the executive team. Okay. Okay. Now, also there's something which is there is 1/3 of the board should be comprised of independent directors. This is very, very important. So, as I said, independent director is one who has no relationship with the company, right? No relationship with the company or anyone, any of its officers. No one, right? Should be able to give independent judgment, right? Should and when we talk of directors, examples of such relation which would deem a director not to be considered as an independent director is a director who's employed by the company or any other related companies for the current or any of the past 3 financial years. Cannot be an independent director who's employed by a company. Okay, a person who has an immediate family member or has had in the past 3 financial years cannot be an independent director. A director who accepts compensation from the company or its related companies in any way cannot, in the immediate year or the past year, is not an independent director. And a director person who has a who is a shareholder of the company or of its partner company, or is an executive officer of any for-profit organization with which the company has any transactions, is also not considered as an independent director. Okay. So these are the 4 conditions that has to be met to become an independent director. Like if these 4 conditions are there, then you are not, like, you cannot have someone, you cannot be connected with the company, you have not worked in the company past 3 years, you do not have any relatives in the who has worked in the company for past 3 years, you should not accept compensation, and you should not be a shareholder or the chief executive officer of any related companies with which this particular company is doing business. Then only can you be an independent director. Otherwise, it's not. Okay. Next comes up is the non-executive directors. A non-executive director or outside director is a member of the board of directors, right? Who does not form part of the executive management team, right? It's not an employee of the company, not affiliated. How are they different? They are different from the inside directors. Inside directors are the people who they're part of the executive team, and they get a salary. Non-executive directors they're often confused with the independent directors, right? Non-executive director. The difference is independent directors do not own shares. Non-executive directors can hold shares. Okay, so. Right. So they can, as I said, the question that comes up, can non-executive directors hold shares? Yes, they can hold shares. They are not part of the executive team, right? How long, what is the term of a non-executive director? 3 years, initially 3 years, but it can be renewed. Okay, so they're not part of the executive team. So, and what happens is it's a board. They are a member of the board of directors, but not a member of the executive management team. They are not employees of the company. Okay, and they are totally different from the executive directors who are members of the board. They are members of the company, right? So they also have the same legal duties, responsibilities as their executive counterparts. uh, Non-executive directors are, they bring in an independent judgment with regards to strategy, performance, allocation of resources, appointments, and also standards of conduct, right? They should be the independent of the management and free from any business on any relationship which could interfere with the exercise of the independent judgment. They should be free of all that. And apart from their fees and shareholding, other than that, they are appointed by a formal procedure, right? And appointment should be for specific terms, and reappointment should not be automatic. It cannot be automatic. And the non-executive directors provide independent judgment. They serve on committee concerned with sensitive issues, concerned with pay of executive directors, other senior management. Uh, they are paid for their services, but they are not employees. Okay. The non-executive directors provide a creative contribution improvement to the board by providing objective criticism and without any biasness. Okay, so they are also referred to as external directors. They are not involved in the day-to-day management activity, but they monitor the executive activity and contribute to the development strategy, right? And they also act as a source of wise independence advice, and they check on any wider elements of the board. They are up there, right? Okay, so non-executive directors. When we talk of non-executive directors and when we talk of them, they are expected, as we said, to focus on the board matters and not into the executive direction. They should provide an independent view of the company, right? That is totally different from the day-to-day running of the business. So they are appointed when they are actually appointed to by the board to ensure that the board is independent, works on an impartial basis, has a wider experience, specific knowledge, and personal qualities. These are some of the things which should be there in the non-executive directors, and that's why they are being appointed, so that there is an element of independence, impartiality, wider experience, special knowledge, and personal qualities are there on the board, which is contributed by the non-executive directors. As I said earlier, the key responsibilities is to contribute to the strategic directions of the company, to solve problems, communicate with third parties, ensuring that all the audit requirements are met, looking after the remuneration of the executive directors, appointing of the board of directors. Okay, they also take care of the strategy, right? They look after the strategy of the development of the strategy of the organization. They look after performance. They also scrutinize the performance of the management when with regards to meeting of goals and objectives, right? And wherever required, they are involved in the removal of the senior management. Risk. The non-executive directors and they are also responsible to see that the financial information provided is accurate. All the financial controls and the systems of risk management, they are defensible. They are stable. With regards to people, like non-executive directors are also responsible for actually determining the levels of remuneration for executive directors. They play a vital role in the appointment and sometimes removal of senior management, and also they are responsible for designing the successful succession planning of the executives. Okay, so they also provide independent views on the resources needed, how it's been, how and when needed, how to utilize it. Appointments of senior management, they also determine, they give their views on the standards of conduct and the organization. So in other words, the non-executive directors or NED, they are the protector of the governance process of an organization. Okay. Executive directors, as we know, who are they? They are part of the management team, right? And their term also should not exceed more than 3 years without the shareholders' approval. They get paid. They are being paid for the work that they're doing, including pensions, stock options that they're getting. Also, performance-related benefits are there for them. Okay, right. So, there is sometimes confusion, there confusion with regards to, like, sometimes arises when we talk, when we say an executive director is as a chief CEO or managing director uh, of an organization. It is said in the US, it's said that the executive directors, they are the chief CEO, and that is this is a title with, if you talk of US, it's quite used in non-profit organizations. Sometimes also in many US non-profit organizations are adopted the title of president or CEO. And this confusion arises because the words executive and director, they occur side by side. See, and so you're saying chief executive officer, executive director. So that creates confusion. So if you say who is an executive director, it's a member of the board who is also an employee with a senior role, right? Boards can have several executive directors, and CEO is heading the management. So CEO and executive CEO is also an executive director, but all executive directors will, just because if you say it's an executive director doesn't mean the person is a CEO. So it's not same, right? Okay, so you have a article, a blog, which you can read this difference between an executive and a non-executive director. So executive directors, the role of the executive directors, designing, developing, and implementing strategic plans for the organization in such a way which is cost effective as well as time efficient. Okay, executive director is a leadership role of an organization, right? They also play a motivational role outside their office work. They should be motivating and mentoring the members and employees, staffs. They should be able to chair meetings also. So the last thing that comes up is the recommendations for the future where the directors are concerned. First is to improve the director compensation. Right, today it's best to actually give compensation direct to the directors in the form of stocks and stock options and make them accountable for their performance. If they would get, if they are, if the so if they are paid in stocks, what happens if the stocks do not perform well? If the company doesn't do well, the stock value goes down, and it's a loss for the directors. So in order to earn more, they would be performing well so that the company does well, and so the directors get the higher returns on the stocks. Okay, increasing the authority of independent directors. It is very much important to ensure that the independent directors are able to actually operate in a more effective manner, to bring about authenticity in the way the board works, to bring about neutrality in the way board works. Okay, and also to make the board accountable. Create a market for independent directors, right? So in how by recruiting a class of outside directors who can actively monitor public corporations. And who does this? It's the institutional investors who can create a market for the independent directors by recruiting outside directors who can monitor all the public corporations. So it's very much needed. So institutional investors have a very important role to play. Having a designated director. Who's a designated director? A director who is specially responsible for the compensation rights that includes communication with shareholders but at the company's expense, and responsibilities that includes all transactions that raise conflicts, questions, or anything to do with law. So it's a director and with a term of 3 years, right? Who is appointed specially for looking after the compensation rights and responsibilities with regards to where shareholders are concerned. Splitting the chairman and CEO position, it's due to the increasing amount of fraud cases happening. More and more demand is coming up today to split the two positions to ensure that both the positions are held by different people. So that would bring about transparency, accountability, and it will help also in the company to run more effectively. It would help the chairman to actually evaluate the CEO's performance, and the CEO also will not take things for granted. Just vote no, right? Just vote no. We are talking of shareholders. Shareholders should just vote no, withhold their votes during the election of directors if they feel that the directors candidates for the potential candidates for the directorial position, if they are not the persons who are fit for that position, who would not fulfill look after the interest of the shareholders, they should just vote no. Audit committees. Audit committees plays a vital role in ensuring that all the financial reports are being disclosed properly, right? And to ensure that the companies are following all the standards, codes of practices, they are disclosing all the information correctly. Board evaluation. There should be a system for evaluating the board, how the board is performing, right? It should be done, and they should evaluate the performance of all the directors, how they are working by themselves individually, how the board committees are working, and also how the board as a whole is working, right? Executive succession meetings. So where there has to be a regular meeting of the outside directors without any management team present, where they can come up with their own individual judgment, own individual in a neutral perspective, from a neutral perspective, give a neutral judgment. So that needs to be there without any interference from the executive committee. Next, the 10th one is succession planning and strategic planning. So boards should be more and more involved both in the succession planning of the CEO and other executives, and also with the strategic planning of the company. Lipton Losch's modest proposal. So Lipton and Losch, they had made some proposal with regards to basic structural changes in the board, such as reducing the size of the board. The directors should spend more time for their board services, and limiting the number of boards that a director can serve. Okay, and some other reforms which they believe would increase the independence of the directors. Okay, they also felt there has to be a designated lead director in the board, which would help in the better way to evaluate the CEO's performance. Making the directors genuinely independent, right? Directors do not become independent just because they have no economic ties to the company beyond their job as a director, right? So what happens? Sometimes disinterested outsiders can mean disinterested, like directors can be, or can also mean that they are uninterested, right? So outside directors, like they are up there, but if they are not able to work properly, then they are not interested. So when we talk of independent directors, it has to be someone who would represent the interest of the shareholders, who for him the interest of the shareholders is most important, right? And who should not think about, who should not succumb to the pressures of the internal directors. So outside directors, right? uh, if they are not able to work, means what happens? They become disinterested, and that means they are uninterested also. Involvement by the federal government, right? So what they had proposed to have a audit corporate audit committee. So in order to improve the effectiveness of the corporate audit committee, they felt that there is a need to create and fund a corporate governance conduct board, and where which would direct the companies to disclose on an annual basis whether they are complying with all the codes, and explain where they are not abiding by, where they are not following the codes. And also to direct this corporate governance conduct board to regularly survey the companies and make it and report to the government and to the public to what extent are these companies abiding by the laws of the nation, whether they are abiding by it, whether they are not abiding by it. Okay, and the last thing that comes up is the involvement by the shareholders, right? Shareholders should exercise control over the selection and the also the priorities of the board. They should involve with the over the selection of the board, and also like who should be up there. So through some sort of like what we say is a collective action vehicle, like they should be. Action vehicle is where you actually, you don't sit like if the board is not performing well, the shareholders should actually take action, should be active, not just succumb to pressures and not just succumb to all the threatenings that comes up. They should actually take an action which should be a collective action, right? They should be very much agile. Then only can the board be more effective. Okay, so that's all that we have for you here. Okay, if there's anything that you have, we will discuss in the class.